Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs. Dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as the last step before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom, giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. I'm single and happy being single, and honestly I think about that scenario too often. Choking on my food, dying alone in my apartment, my cat eating my face. This story circulates every year at my medical school. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or CT of the upper chest, abdomen, pelvis. No bullet. At that point someone said, "Duck it, let's scan the whole body." Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa, area behind the knee. It had embolized, traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. How the duck does a bullet even fit inside a blood vessel? There's a story that circulates every year at my school about a guy who pooped in a dryer and turned it on. I did not go to medical school. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon's medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Last casualty of the Vietnam War. So the accident wouldn't have killed him without the bullet there? My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side, and died in her 60s from a heart attack. But while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer. But she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they were brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s and I still have to wonder what this guy did to beep someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. How did the shotgun blast not show any outward signs? One would imagine at least some kind of visible wound from that. That guy must have clenched his cheeks hard. Man, that's wild. Not a forensic pathologist or ME, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories, but the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an ME who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid and then injecting it. It reached his heart and clogged it up, and that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. R.I.P. Reese's in pieces. What's the thought process there? I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to duck with those pathology somnobeaches one last time. Not a doctor, but recently I was reading about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and one person's perspective. When their family member who experienced the disaster died many years later, they were cremated and left, and their ashes were tiny pieces of broken glass and metal from the initial explosions. Edit. Article here. https://www.nationalgeographic.com magazine/2020/06/ for Hiroshima survivors. Horror of nuclear attack is still vivid feature. It requires a subscription, but you should be able to read it because I put a after com. Thanks you, but a surprise. Do you happen to have a link or anything? This is really interesting to me. Thank you. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. The sad part about this is that babies sometimes just cry. There is nothing wrong with them. They are tired and just can't sleep. Jesus Christ. I hope your friend is doing okay. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they're made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. After my mother was cremated, my sister was curious and wanted to take a peek at her ashes inside the urn. She opened it and said, "Oh, right on top of these fine ashes was the hardware from the broken ankle repair she had gotten years before." https://en Wikipedia. Wiki retained surgical instruments. Not a doctor, but I did a necropsy on one of my birds a couple weeks ago. I couldn't tell how she died before it happened, but after opening her up I found about 14 masses of tissue in her reproductive system. At first I thought it was cancer from dissecting one of the masses. Later I found out it was actually an intestinal infection. Edit, it was actually a reproductive tract infection. Some of y'all were asking about the vulture that lives in my backyard named Randy, so I made Aranda the vulture. I had to do one on one of my birds the other day too. She had a mass of fluid the size of a closed fist inside her. 150 grams of fluid weight. It was pushing everything inside to the outside, and we never even saw that coming. Cystic oviduct. I'm sorry about your bird, comma. Nice. Please smash the subscribe button to enjoy daily AskReddit content. I'm a med student, not a pathologist or coroner. But in anatomy lab the tank next to me had a donor with an inflatable penis pump inside his scrotum and shaft. It was completely self-contained. Fluid in the container in the scrotum could be pumped into the shaft tube, creating an erection. Then the fluid would just be released back into the pump and the boner would go away. Pretty wild. I know a guy with one of these. He's gay and was sent to gay conversion therapy when he was young, and it killed his ability to get hard, like physically, and so he has to use one of these. Very sad. Suru, the guy had to press his balls to get an erection. Totally not related but somewhat related. My sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her classes involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wheeled in a body, and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. I'll keep this out of the main thread with the other unrelated stuff. Have a friend that was vegetarian because she had to attend dissections for pharmacy. Apparently slicing human muscle was too much like roast beef for her. I was in charge of making copies of all evidence to be used in the trial of Donald Harvey in 1989. He was known as the Angel of Death. One bit of evidence was an autopsy photo of an exhumed elderly woman. The examiner was holding with tweezers an 18-piece of cotton being pulled from her throat. Harvey liked to stuff cotton so far down into the victim's throats that it could not be seen. I still can't shake the image from my brain. God, that's ducking horrible. Oh dear God, no. Distraught face with tightly closed eyes. I did the autopsy of both the robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their fourth lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. Does a sectioned aorta mean instant death? Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. We have a man's liver in a pot at my uni, and it is rather large, but more importantly it looks Dalmatian spotted with metastatic melanoma. After that class I immediately made an appointment for that afternoon to organize a biopsy on what turned out to be one on my arm. I took forensic lectures, so I saw quite a bit of crazy shocks, but the things that stick is an autopsy revealing a history of abuse, pain and violence. A little more funny, a skeleton was found in the near mountains. It was very clear he died in an accident 20 plus years ago. However, he had to be identified via DNA. Turned out his dad was not his dad, but his uncle. Sparked a whole public family drama show. cause the family was well known in my area. We found your son that went missing 2 decades ago. Also you're with cheated and now with your brother Havigadone. It's Arrested Development, isn't it? I'm not a pathologist but I work in a field adjacent to it. One patient was heart attack caused by cocaine use. The heart was apparently giant, like having to use cocaine just to keep the heart going. My dad used to be a pathologist assistant and had to quit after a teenage suicide around the age of my brother, then a couple or 3 SIDS cases, which is sudden infant death syndrome, in the same week. I visited a dissection lab at a nearby university when I was in high school and one guy was laid out on the table in front. We asked how he died and the professor pointed at a jar and said that's how, and it was the guy's heart. It was bigger than his head. Wait, so was the heart large from cocaine use? Or was the heart so large that the only way to keep it going was by using more cocaine? Which came first? I worked at a coroner's office for a while and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix and he ended up choking to death. I initially misread this as you put your finger into your own mouth to verify that it was blueberry muffin mix and I gagged. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. Sorry for your loss. I hope the autopsy brings some clarity and closure for you. My condolences. Stay strong. I heard a story once about a guy who died, and completely unrelated to the main complaint, during the autopsy they found a grapefruit in his ass. Apparently it had just been there the whole time. I've heard of a navel orange, but never an anal grapefruit. My uncle is in a doc and said like 10% of all visits are people shoving things up their butt. Nice. Please smash the subscribe button to enjoy daily AskReddit content. Worked at an animal hospital. They did autopsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc. to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The hospital vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. That will clear out the intestinal tract quite nicely. Wounded angry alligator on the loose. Did it end up living? I am not a pathologist, but when my father died from drowning, it was noted he had acute cirrhosis of the liver. The coroner also removed a bullet from between his heart and spine that dad received in Vietnam. It was very degraded. He had also lost a thumb and several feet of intestine there, the evidence of which was noted in the report. Dad had served 22 years in the army, and he had been awarded the Purple Heart 3 times. He lived a hard life after, and it was speculated he would have passed soon of cirrhosis of the liver had he not drowned. A suspect had been arrested for murder. During the autopsy it was determined the decedent had been shot post-mortem. Several hours post-mortem, the decedent's cause of death was an MI, so the suspect was charged with abuse of a corpse. It makes you wonder what goes through people's minds. What's an MI? I'm not a doctor, but my uncle, dad's only brother, died when he was 17 in a car accident in 1975. They did an autopsy and told my grandparents he died on impact and didn't suffer. My dad personally knew the autopsy doctor and he told him that he didn't die on impact. He suffered for a bit and had internal bleeding, and that's what ultimately caused his death. My dad hasn't and will never tell his parents. My auntie is a coroner and she was told to expect nothing more than a gunshot wound to her pregnant female. Which is what it was, but the bullet had killed the woman and 9-month developed baby who had the bullet pass through and end up in the palm of its hand like it was holding it. I hate this story. What the duck, that is horrific. Disclaimer, not a pathologist. In anatomy lab in medical school, we found one of the cadavers had a penis pump. There's a pump you squeeze in the scrotum that pushes water, stored up in a hard plastic water balloon in the abdominal cavity, into a tube in the penis. Other story I've told before, but I was dissecting the back of a knee when the knee implant, that I didn't know was there, popped out. For a brief Stupid moment, I thought it was a Terminator and screeched. You screw England classmates by any chance? Bad accident during high school, missing scalp of young girl, coroner couldn't find it. My buddy worked at impound yard and found it embedded in broken windshield frame glass. Pretty gruesome. My high school science teacher was a coroner or whatever, and one day was asked to perform an autopsy on a little girl who was shot by a shotgun. He quit on the spot. He was an absolutely fantastic teacher. Do you know what the cause of death was? But seriously though, just imaging that makes me feel sick. Fingers crossed he didn't actually have to see her. I know everyone hates me, but I'm a deputy sheriff coroner. Kids' cases haunt you, especially when you have kids around the same age. Not a doctor, but in a dissection of an extremely emaciated cat in biology class we found a small piece of cellophane blocking her ileum, the flap in the stomach that leads to the large intestines. The poor kitty had been able to eat but starved to death because her body was unable to extract nutrients from the food, As a student in the medical field, I had the opportunity to visit a cadaver lab. I was very surprised to see how many people had died from choking. Out of the 12 or so cadavers in the lab that day, at least 7 or 8 were from choking. I went home and immediately looked up how to perform self-Heimlich. Were they otherwise impaired? People with other health problems ranging from dementia to stroke are at much greater risk of choking. This is why I have a life vac. Nice. Please smash the subscribe button to enjoy daily AskReddit content. There was this girl my mum grew up with on an army base. She had a really long plait she used to chew on in her sleep, and she choked to death on a hairball once. Apparently it was the size of a kiwi fruit lodged in her throat. She choked to death on a hairball once is usually all it takes. Trichophagia is such a fascinating yet saddening phenomenon. I was an investigator for a state medical examiner for just over 2 years. Had a mom that had drank herself to death according to the husband after relapsing on Mother's Day weekend. I just felt like something was off. Sent her for an autopsy. Had a ruptured liver where dude had essentially beat her till she internally bled to death. Later, while out on bail, he stole a semi-truck, crashed it in a pond, got out shooting at a deputy, and they killed him. Saved the taxpayers a good chunk of money. What if she actually did drink herself to death? He was distraught about that and being accused of killing her and decided to do a suicide by cop. Situation of someone I know. They were working late on a weekday night with few staff in the building. They were in the hallway when all of a sudden he felt a hand on his shoulder which totally scared the hell out of him. The hand was from a guy with a tag on him who was recently pronounced dead. Guy either came back from dead or had a very light pulse at time of declaration. Can't remember which. They would just have to swap the tag from him to me because I would die on the spot. That's terrifying. Something I found out because of an autopsy, not doing one myself. My brother died from a drug overdose, and I went to see his body. There was a seasoned medical examiner there and a new hire. The new hire told me that most of my brother's tattoos were gang related. The seasoned examiner looked at him like he was a moron. Wish he never told me. I'm so sorry. My inbox is open. Med student here. Had a guy OD on cocaine which he frequently used. Was an alcoholic for 30+ years and had a history of seizures. Evidently he had been hit in the head with a baseball as a young adult and never saw doc. I went to take his brain out and this dude had a walnut-sized hole in his skull. And the brain underneath looked like someone had taken an ice cream scoop to it. He had been walking around 30+ years with this hole in his head and having seizures BC of it. No wonder he started drinking. His liver was absolutely normal though.